In 1982, millions watched a medical crime on live television. World champion Aaron Pryor was completely exhausted. His body was shutting down. To save the fight, his trainer gave him a black bottle filled with illegal drugs. The chemicals worked instantly. Pryor turned into a machine and knocked his opponent out cold. But the real crime happened after the bell. The Athletic Commission deliberately lost his urine sample to destroy the evidence. They allowed a desperate fighter to be illegally drugged just to protect their $1 million payday. Aaron Pryor did not enter the boxing gym with aspirations of Olympic glory or a love for the sweet science. Boxing in these neighborhoods was a sanctioned mechanism for street survival. The gym was a filtration system. Promoters and local handlers used these inner-city sweatboxes to pan for human gold. Hundreds of kids came through the doors, absorbing brain damage in sparring sessions, functioning as free sparring partners for established local pros. The vast majority were broken and discarded. A select few demonstrated the specific type of durable aggression the industry could monetize. Pryor was one of them. His aggression was not a stylistic choice. It was a deeply ingrained psychological defense mechanism. Growing up in an environment entirely devoid of a safety net, hesitation meant victimization. Pryor learned early that striking first and relentlessly was the only effective currency. This trauma-induced hypervigilance translated perfectly into the ring. He fought like a man locked in a phone booth with a predator. He threw punches in massive, chaotic volumes, overwhelming opponents not with technical supremacy, but with sheer, unadulterated panic aggression. This feral style allowed him to dominate the amateur circuit. Pryor compiled a staggering amateur record of 204 wins and only 16 losses. He won the National AAU Lightweight Championship in 1973 and the National Golden Gloves Lightweight Championship in 1975. He fought over 220 times before turning professional. The physical toll of that many fights on a developing neurological system is severe, but the amateur boxing system does not track long-term brain health. It tracks tournament brackets. Young men bled in local gymnasiums and regional arenas to secure plastic trophies, while the amateur athletic union and local politicians extracted the prestige and networking capital. Pryor was an unpaid employee of a vast, unregulated athletic machine. By 1976, the machinery geared up for its largest commercial and geopolitical spectacle, the Montreal Olympic Games. The Olympics were not just a sporting event. They were a massive broadcast property for the ABC television network and a propaganda tool for the American government during the Cold War. The United States Olympic Committee and the television executives needed marketable commodities. They needed young men who could be packaged and sold to Middle America. They wanted articulate, clean-cut, telegenic athletes. They wanted Sugar Ray Leonard. They wanted Howard Davis Jr. They did not want Aaron Pryor. Pryor was too wild, too unpredictable, and his fighting style was terrifyingly violent. He did not fit the corporate mold. The Olympic trials became the starkest display of industry politics. It was the exact moment the system told Pryor he was a second-class asset. The trials were designed to select the absolute best fighters, but the judging in amateur boxing is notoriously subjective, heavily influenced by the preferences of the establishment. The climax of Pryor's amateur career arrived at the 1976 Olympic trials. He was matched against Howard Davis Jr. Davis was a phenomenal fighter. But he was also the exact prototype the system favored, a smooth, technical, aesthetically pleasing boxer from New York. Pryor fought with his signature manic intensity, turning the bout into a brawl, but the judges preferred the polished optics of Davis. Pryor lost the decision. The defeat was not just a loss on a scorecard. It was an economic death sentence in the amateur ranks. Davis was anointed as the chosen lightweight representative. The establishment consolidated its resources behind him. To add insult to the psychological injury, the Olympic Committee selected Pryor as an alternate. He was forced to travel to Montreal, not as a competitor, but as an insurance policy. For weeks, Pryor sat outside the ropes in Montreal. He watched the corporate machinery function at full capacity. He watched Sugar Ray Leonard smile for the cameras and secure a future of multi-million-dollar endorsements. He watched Howard Davis Jr. win the gold medal in the Val Barker Trophy for the most outstanding boxer of the games. He saw the establishment crown its kings and hand them the keys to generational wealth. Pryor received nothing. He was barred from the spotlight, marginalized by the very system he had bled for over 220 times. The psychological fracture was complete. The 1976 Olympics proved to Pryor that merit, sweat, and a 204-16 record meant nothing if the executives in suits decided you were not the right product. The system had explicitly rejected him. When the games ended, the gold medalists returned to America to sign lucrative professional contracts with elite promoters and major television networks. Pryor returned to Cincinnati empty-handed. He was a 21-year-old man with no marketable skills outside of violence, entirely locked out of the boxing establishment's penthouse. The realization galvanized him. He stripped away any remaining illusions about the nobility of the sport. As he prepared to turn professional, he did not view boxing as an athletic pursuit. He viewed it as a hostile industry that owed him money. He was entering the professional ranks not as a sportsman, but as a discarded asset out for blood, fully aware that he would have to kill the system's golden boys to get paid. November 12, 1976. Aaron Pryor signed his first professional boxing contract. He did not sign in a Manhattan boardroom surrounded by television executives. He signed with Buddy LaRosa, a local Cincinnati pizza parlor owner. This was the fundamental power vacuum that defined Pryor's career. The heavyweight power brokers of the era, Don King and Bob Arum, controlled the major television networks and the sanctioning bodies. They ignored Pryor. LaRosa possessed local capital, but he held absolutely zero political leverage within the global boxing syndicate. Pryor entered a multi-million-dollar mob-infiltrated industry managed by a man who sold pepperoni. The financial reality was immediate and brutal. Pryor's professional debut against Larry Jones earned him $400. He knocked Jones out in the second round. He fought 14 times in his first 2 years. These were not televised spectacles. They were grinding, untelevised regional bouts in smoky Ohio halls and minor arenas. While the network-backed fighters secured six-figure purses for exhibition matches, Pryor was a local hazard fighting for four-figure paychecks. His manager took a standard 33% cut. The IRS took its share. Training expenses drained the rest. Pryor was accumulating physical damage while remaining entirely financially insecure. He became the most mathematically unviable opponent in the sport. Boxing is an economic calculation. established contenders, and rising stars assess risk versus reward. Pryor represented maximum physical risk with zero financial reward. He possessed no television contract, meaning a fight with him guaranteed no broadcast revenue. Consequently, the top tier of the lightweight and junior welterweight divisions enforced a strict embargo against him. Promoters actively shielded their investments from Pryor. He was forced into the role of the opponent, the fighter brought in on short notice to test prospects. He dismantled them all. He knocked out Norman Goins. He annihilated Leonidas Asprilla. He destroyed Lennox Blackmore. Every knockout further isolated him. The more lethal he proved to be, the harder the system worked to freeze him out. By late 1979, the sanctioning bodies could no longer legally ignore his record. The World Boxing Association ranked him as the #1 contender for the junior welterweight title. The champion was Antonio Cervantes, a Colombian veteran known as Kid Pambele. Cervantes was a seasoned, highly respected champion with deep ties to the establishment promoters. The WBA mandated the title defense. This was not a generous opportunity. It was a structural obligation. The financial terms of the championship contract exposed the industry's hierarchy. The fight was scheduled for August 2, 1980, at the Riverfront Coliseum in Cincinnati. Cervantes, as the A-side champion, dictated the economics. Pryor was guaranteed a flat purse of $50,000. It was the largest paycheck of his life, but it was a fraction of the market rate for a world title fight. Sugar Ray Leonard, fighting in the same era and the same weight class vicinity, was negotiating purses exceeding $1 million per fight. Pryor was fighting for the undisputed world championship for the equivalent of a middle management salary, minus taxes, minus management fees, minus training camp costs. The fight itself was a display of sheer survival instinct. In the first round, Cervantes landed a right hand that dropped Pryor to the canvas. The establishment expected the unrefined, untelevised challenger to fold. Pryor beat the count. He did not retreat to technical boxing. He accelerated the violence. He overwhelmed Cervantes with an unrelenting, chaotic volume of punches. In the fourth round, Pryor trapped Cervantes on the ropes and delivered a sequence of heavy hooks that left the champion unconscious. Pryor secured the WBA junior welterweight belt. He assumed the championship would force the system to accept him. He believed the belt equated to institutional power. The reality check was immediate. The city of Cincinnati organized a victory parade to celebrate their new world champion. Pryor arrived expecting a ticker tape reception, corporate sponsors, and media conglomerates. He found exactly one convertible car waiting on a largely empty street. There were no major television crews. There were no lucrative endorsement contracts waiting for his signature. The corporate sponsors looked at Pryor, a manic, hyper-aggressive fighter with no media polish, and determined he was not brand safe. The championship belt did not bring protection. It brought the apex predators. With Cervantes defeated, the major promoters finally turned their attention to Pryor. Bob Arum and Don King did not want to build Pryor's legacy. They wanted to control the WBA belt to leverage their own fighters. Buddy LaRosa was immediately out of his depth. The major promoters began executing maneuvers to corner Pryor's management. They presented co-promotional contracts designed to siphon the majority of the revenue while stripping LaRosa of his decision-making authority. They controlled the television dates. If Pryor wanted to fight on CBS, NBC, or ABC, he had to go through them. If he refused, they would freeze him out, leaving him to defend his world title in untelevised arenas for minimal purses. Pryor recognized the trap. He held the most dangerous belt in boxing, but he was surrounded by executives actively plotting to bleed his value. He severed ties with La Rosa. It was a desperate attempt to seize control of his own business, but firing his manager left him completely isolated. He stepped into the apex of the 1980s boxing industry entirely alone. He had no legal team capable of fighting the promoter's contracts. He had no experienced negotiator to demand higher purses. He was a lone asset in a market controlled by cartels. The promoters tightened the vice. They offered him mandatory challengers, tough, dangerous fighters for suppressed purses. Pryor had to accept. If he declined to fight due to inadequate pay, the WBA would strip him of his title for failing to defend against a mandatory challenger. The system weaponized the rulebook against him. He was forced to defend his world championship repeatedly, absorbing compounding neurological trauma just to generate enough capital to pay his living expenses. He was a world champion operating check to check. The industry had successfully cornered him. They required him to risk his life inside the ring every few months, while they retained absolute control of the bank vault outside of it. The mechanics of professional boxing in the early 1980s were not governed by athletic merit or a standardized ranking system. They were dictated by a legal instrument known as the option clause. When Aaron Pryor secured the WBA junior welterweight title, he assumed the belt represented leverage. He was severely mistaken. The major power brokers of the era, promoters like Don King and Bob Arum, controlled the television networks, and the networks controlled the capital. To secure a lucrative nationally televised fight, a champion was required to sign an option clause. This was a contractual chokehold. It legally stipulated that if a promoter granted a fighter a television date, that promoter automatically owned the exclusive promotional rights to the fighter's next 3 to 5 bouts. It was a closed-loop system designed to enforce a monopoly. If Pryor refused to sign, he was blacklisted from the broadcast schedules. He would be relegated to defending his world championship in obscure, untelevised regional venues for a fraction of his true market value. The industry did not allow for independent contractors. It demanded indentured servitude. The financial reality of Pryor's early title defenses exposed the illusion of his new status. A 6-figure purse in the boxing industry is a gross figure, not a net reality. When Pryor signed a contract, the money was immediately dissected by an entire ecosystem of mandatory expenses and institutional parasites. The IRS levied heavy taxes. Training camps required the rental of private facilities, the hiring of specialized trainers, and the payment of multiple high-level sparring partners who demanded premium compensation for enduring Pryor's violent daily sessions. Furthermore, there were unofficial handlers, fixers, and exorbitant mandatory sanctioning body fees required just to keep the belt. A $100,000 purse rapidly dissolved into a $25,000 net payday. Pryor was generating massive revenue for the WBA, the arenas, and the local economies, but he was retaining pennies on the dollar. He was the undisputed world champion, yet the financial structure ensured he remained exactly one loss away from insolvency. He was on a treadmill, forced to fight continuously just to maintain a baseline operating budget. To keep that cash flow alive, Pryor needed the media to sell his fights, but the broadcast networks, CBS, NBC, ABC, and the emerging pay-per-view giant, HBO, had no interest in marketing Pryor as a skilled, dedicated athlete. They needed a villain to drive ratings. The television executives recognized the raw, aggressive energy born from his Cincinnati street trauma, and they weaponized it. They officially branded him the Hawk. They stripped away his humanity and packaged him as a chaotic, terrifying force of nature. Network commentators focused exclusively on his wild eyes, his relentless forward pressure, and his apparent lack of conventional control. They built a narrative of a savage brawler, serving as the perfect foil for their polished, telegenic A-side stars. The media did not document Aaron Pryor, the man. They commodified a stereotype. They sold the public the thrill of watching a dangerous, unhinged element who might snap at any moment inside the ring. This relentless media framing executed a severe psychological toll. The industry demanded that Pryor play the role of the monster to secure his paychecks. Consequently, he internalized the isolation. After severing ties with his initial management, Pryor was forced to navigate the boardroom entirely alone. He was a fighter attempting to litigate his own worth against seasoned, predatory attorneys and corporate promoters. The stress of attempting to survive the business side of the sport began to fracture his focus. He realized that the executives sitting ringside in custom suits were making millions off his physical deterioration, while he was absorbing compounding neurological damage just to keep his head above water. He had no financial advisor to invest his money, no legal team to dismantle the option clauses, and no public relations firm to humanize his image. He was completely exposed. The ultimate manifestation of this systemic exploitation arrived in the spring of 1982. The system finally dangled the ultimate bait, a unification bout against the undisputed superstar of the era, Sugar Ray Leonard. This was the fight Pryor had been chasing since he was locked out of the 1976 Olympic team. A contract was aggressively negotiated. Pryor was guaranteed $750,000. It was the financial life raft that would finally secure his future and validate his entire brutal career. He signed the paperwork. He began preparing for the war. Then the trapdoor opened. Before the fight could be finalized, Leonard suffered a detached retina in a preliminary tune-up bout and abruptly announced his retirement from the sport. The contract evaporated overnight. The $750,000 disappeared into the ether. Pryor was left standing at the altar of the boxing establishment, completely abandoned, with his debts mounting and his prime athletic years ticking away. The system proved that his financial security was entirely dependent on the health and whims of the men the industry actually valued. Driven to the edge by the collapse of the Leonard fight, Pryor was forced into a desperate pivot. He required a massive event immediately. The promoters recognized his vulnerability and presented an ultimatum, a showdown with the legendary Nicaraguan champion, Alexis Arguello. Arguello was a 3-division world champion stepping up in weight to challenge for Pryor's 140-pound belt. The event was dubbed the Battle of the Champions by Top Rank's Bob Arum. On paper, it was a historic clash. In reality, it was an economic hostage situation. Arguello was the establishment's chosen hero, elegant, eloquent, impeccably dressed, and backed by a massive international following. Pryor was the reigning defending champion, yet the industry explicitly treated him like a stepping stone. While Pryor ultimately negotiated a career-high purse of $1.6 million for the bout, the money came with a lethal caveat. There was no multi-fight safety net. There were no guaranteed promotional extensions if he failed. During the press tours, the contrast was violently clear. Arguello sat in tailored suits discussing legacy. Pryor paced the stages, visibly agitated, knowing the axe was hanging over his neck. Ahead of the November 1982 clash, Pryor laid bare the terrifying stakes of his existence to the press. He summarized the precise mechanics of his exploitation in one sentence. If he loses, he is still a champion. But if I lose, everything ends. My boundary is either working for $4.95 an hour or being the world champion. This was the absolute crux of the trap. Arguello could lose, drop back down to his natural weight class, and continue earning millions as a beloved international icon. Pryor had zero equity in the industry. The promoters had ensured he built no brand beyond his current title defense. He was fighting for $1.6 million, but he was also fighting for his literal survival in society. The system had deliberately stripped away every possible exit route. They backed an unstable, desperate man into a corner and forced him to wager his physical health, his sanity, and his entire existence under the bright lights of the Miami Orange Bowl. They demanded a bloodletting, and they engineered the perfect pressure cooker to ensure it happened. The physical disintegration of a professional boxer does not happen under the stadium lights. It happens behind closed doors in the damp isolation of training camps, far from the cameras. By the time Aaron Pryor relocated his camp to Miami to prepare for Alexis Arguello in the fall of 1982, his body was already cashing checks his neurological system could no longer cover. He had fought over 200 amateur bouts and nearly 40 professional fights. His fighting style, a relentless, high-volume assault, required a cardiovascular engine that defied human physiology. But the human body is not a machine, and the debt for that kind of sustained violence is always collected. Pryor was breaking down. His joints ached chronically. The recovery time between sparring sessions stretched dangerously long. The armor was cracking. The industry did not provide sports psychologists or physical therapists to manage this decay. They provided enablers. The psychological weight of the impending Arguello fight, the knowledge that a single loss meant a return to total poverty, shattered Pryor's remaining mental stability. To cope with the compounding physical pain and the crushing anxiety of his economic reality, Pryor turned to the only anesthetic readily available in the 1980s boxing underworld: cocaine. It did not start as a public spectacle. It started as a private mechanism to numb the sheer terror of his existence. The drug offered a temporary, synthetic armor against the pressure of the multi-million-dollar contract hanging over his head. It allowed him to project the persona of the hawk when his actual mind was fracturing. The power brokers knew. The boxing industry is an intimate, gossip-fueled syndicate. Spies infiltrate every training camp. The promoters, the handlers, and the network executives were fully aware of Pryor's erratic behavior, his missed training sessions, and the massive chemical red flags flying over his camp. They chose absolute, synchronized silence. Acknowledging Pryor's substance abuse would require an intervention, a postponement of the fight, and the catastrophic loss of millions in pay-per-view revenue, ticket sales, and casino site fees. The system made a clinical calculation. Pryor's long-term survival was irrelevant compared to the immediate cash yield of the November 12th date. They needed a warm body in the ring, regardless of how chemically compromised that body was. Recognizing his own deteriorating stamina and the technical superiority of Arguello, Pryor required a cornerman who operated outside the boundaries of conventional athletic ethics. He hired Panama Lewis. Lewis was not a master tactician or a traditional boxing purist. He was a notorious fixer, a man with a dark reputation for exploiting regulatory loopholes and weaponizing the gray areas of the sport. Lewis understood the assignment. He was not hired to improve Pryor's footwork. He was hired to ensure Pryor survived 15 rounds by any means necessary. The alliance was forged in mutual desperation. Lewis looked at Pryor and saw a rapidly degrading asset. He knew that traditional conditioning would not be enough to sustain the frantic pace required to beat Arguello. Lewis began preparing alternative contingencies. The boundary between athletic training and chemical tampering officially dissolved inside the Miami camp. The blatant negligence of the regulatory authorities paved the way for the impending disaster. The Miami Boxing Commission was tasked with ensuring the health and safety of the fighters. In reality, they functioned as a bureaucratic rubber stamp to protect the local economy. The pre-fight medical examinations were a dangerous charade. A physician checked Pryor's blood pressure, listened to his heart, and signed the paperwork. They deliberately ignored the elevated resting heart rate, the dilated pupils, and the frantic manic energy that radiated from the champion. They did not order comprehensive blood work. They did not mandate drug testing protocols that would have immediately exposed the toxicity in Pryor's system. They weaponized their own incompetence. Looking closely meant risking the cancellation of the biggest sporting event in the city's history. This was not an oversight. It was a systemic conspiracy of willful blindness. The commission members, the ringside physicians, and the local politicians were all tethered to the economic engine of the fight. Canceling the bout would have triggered massive lawsuits from Top Rank, HBO, and the city's hospitality sector. They prioritized the commercial integrity of the broadcast over the biological reality of the fighter. They signed the medical clearance forms, legally authorizing a physically compromised, psychologically unhinged man to step into a cage with one of the most lethal knockout artists of the century. On the eve of the fight, the hotel room in Miami became a pressure cooker of impending violence. The polished media narrative sold to the public was a clash of titans, the savage brawler versus the elegant technician. The grim reality was a massive corporate entity pushing a damaged, chemically reliant worker to the absolute brink of human endurance. Pryor was entirely isolated. He had no safety net, no clean bill of health, and a corner man actively preparing a cocktail of illicit substances to keep his heart beating through the later rounds. The system had successfully set the stage. They had extracted his youth, ignored his addiction, and compromised his medical safety. All that remained was to lock the cage doors and wait for the blood to flow so they could count the receipts. November 12, 1982. The Miami Orange Bowl was not a venue for a sporting exhibition. It was an open-air crucible designed for maximum extraction. 46,000 people packed the stadium under the humid Florida sky. In the VIP sections sat the power brokers, casino executives, and television executives. They were the shareholders of the violence. Inside the ring stood Aaron Pryor and Alexis Arguello. They were the inventory. The bell rang, and Pryor immediately initiated a pace that defied human biology. He did not box. He executed a frantic, high-volume assault designed to overwhelm Arguello before his own compromised cardiovascular system collapsed. For the first 10 rounds, Pryor threw an average of over 100 punches per round. This is a statistical anomaly. The human heart and lungs are not built to sustain that level of output while simultaneously absorbing blunt force trauma to the cranium. Arguello, a master technician, did not panic. He weathered the barrage and began landing precise, heavy counter-strikes. Every time Arguello landed his signature right hand, it sent shock waves through Pryor's nervous system. The media broadcast framed this as a heroic clash of wills. The clinical reality was a systematic destruction of human tissue. By the 11th round, both men were operating in a state of severe biological distress. Their kidneys were processing muscle breakdown. Their brains were swelling against the inside of their skulls from the repeated deceleration of impact. Lactic acid saturated their muscles, making their arms feel like lead. Pryor's manic energy, fueled by desperation and an undisclosed training camp regimen, was finally evaporating. The structural integrity of his body was failing. Round 13 was the breaking point. Arguello timed Pryor's chaotic forward movement and delivered a devastating right cross flush to the jaw. Pryor's head snapped back violently. His legs unraveled. The nervous system malfunctioned. He stumbled backward, his eyes unfocused, surviving the final seconds of the round purely on primal instinct and the ropes holding him upright. The bell rang. Pryor staggered back to his corner. He collapsed onto the stool. He was empty. The physical engine had seized. The multi-million-dollar asset was seconds away from a total shutdown. This is the exact moment the ultimate exploitation occurred. The television cameras pushed in close. The HBO microphone suspended directly above the corner captured audio that remains the most damning piece of evidence in modern boxing history. Panama Lewis, Pryor's head trainer, barked an order to the cutman, Artie Curley. Curley handed Lewis a standard plastic water bottle. Lewis aggressively pushed it back. "No," Lewis ordered, "not that bottle, the one I mixed. Give me the other bottle." Lewis grabbed a black taped-up flask. He jammed it into Pryor's mouth and squeezed the dark liquid down his throat. He did not offer technical advice. He did not give a motivational speech. He administered a chemical dosage. The broadcast team briefly acknowledged the strange audio, then immediately moved on. The fight was the product, and questioning the integrity of the product on live television was bad for business. Years later, Lewis and the Pryor camp constructed a flimsy, insulting lie. They claimed the bottle contained peppermint schnapps mixed with Perrier water to settle Pryor's upset stomach. This is a medical absurdity. Pouring alcohol down the throat of a severely dehydrated, concussed man operating at a heart rate of 180 beats per minute would induce immediate vomiting, not a sudden surge of world-class stamina. The industry insiders, the pharmacological experts, and the regulatory bodies knew exactly what was in the black bottle. It was a pulverized antihistamine, commonly believed to be an asthma medication, dissolved in water. In a state of extreme fatigue, the human body naturally restricts airways to limit exertion and prevent a heart attack. It is a biological safety mechanism. The antihistamine cocktail brutally overrides that mechanism. It violently dilates the bronchial tubes. This allows a massive, unnatural influx of oxygen into the lungs. The oxygen violently flushes the lactic acid from the muscles and forces the heart to accelerate past its red line. It provides an immediate artificial reboot of the central nervous system. It was not a miracle. It was an illegal, highly dangerous biochemical intervention. Lewis played chemist with a compromised fighter's heart to protect a multi-million-dollar outcome. When the bell rang for round 14, the physiological impossibility was broadcast to the world. A man who was virtually unconscious 60 seconds earlier leaped off his stool with the terrifying energy of a fresh fighter in the first round. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and vacant. He marched directly at Arguello, completely ignoring the risk of incoming fire. Arguello, exhausted and operating on the assumption that his opponent was broken, was entirely unprepared for the chemically induced resurrection. Pryor cornered Arguello against the ropes and unleashed a horrific, unbroken sequence of more than 20 unanswered punches. Heavy, thudding hooks and crosses slammed into Arguello's unprotected head. The referee, Stanley Christodoulou, froze. He allowed the assault to continue far past the point of sport. Arguello's eyes rolled back. His body slumped, suspended only by the middle rope, completely unconscious before he finally slid to the canvas. The stadium erupted. The commentators screamed about one of the greatest comebacks in the history of the sport. The narrative was instantly solidified. Aaron Pryor had dug deep into his soul to find the will to win. The cold truth was entirely different. The public had just paid to watch a medically sanctioned assault. They watched a handler pump illicit drugs into a desperate worker to ensure he could inflict maximum brain damage on a rival employee. The criminality of the night did not end with the knockout. It was cemented by the subsequent regulatory cover-up. The Florida State Boxing Commission was the governing body legally mandated to ensure fair play and fighter safety. Standard operating procedure for any world championship fight requires an immediate post-fight urinalysis. The commission officials were ringside. They heard the HBO audio. They saw the black bottle. They witnessed the unnatural physical transformation in round 14. They possessed every piece of probable cause required to launch an immediate investigation. Instead, they executed a deliberate, coordinated failure of duty. The commission officials neglected to administer the drug test. They allowed Pryor to leave the arena. They allowed his camp to pack their bags and exit the state. The urine sample, the only definitive physical evidence of the crime, was never collected. It was allowed to vanish. This was not incompetence. It was a strategic financial decision. If the commission tested Pryor and the results came back positive for banned substances, the fight would be declared a no contest. Pryor would be stripped of his title, but more importantly, the controversy would shatter the public's trust and completely incinerate the financial viability of an inevitable, highly lucrative rematch. The promoters needed the controversy to sell the second fight, but they could not afford the legal reality of a disqualified champion. The system closed ranks. The regulators protected the promoters protected the broadcast networks. Everyone got paid. Aaron Pryor kept his belt, unaware that the very establishment that turned a blind eye to his drugging in Miami was the same establishment that would completely abandon him once the chemicals finally destroyed his mind. The aftermath of the Miami spectacle did not bring institutional validation. It brought a highly profitable, carefully orchestrated sequel. The promoters capitalized on the controversy they had actively helped bury, orchestrating a rematch with Alexis Arguello in 1983. Pryor won again, this time definitively, without the aid of Panama Lewis or the infamous black bottle. He dismantled Arguello in 10 rounds, proving his athletic supremacy beyond any reasonable doubt. Yet the gatekeepers of the sport had already established his commercial ceiling. He was the undisputed king of the 140-pound division, but he was permanently anchored to a weight class where he had already cleared out all viable money-making contenders. The mid-1980s boxing economy was monopolized by the four kings: Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Thomas Hearns, and Roberto Duran. These men traded wins, losses, and multi-million-dollar contracts in an exclusive, closed-loop system of pay-per-view super fights. Pryor was undeniably the most dangerous fighter on the planet, standing just one weight class below them. He publicly challenged this elite circle. He demanded the opportunity to unify titles and secure the generational wealth that accompanied those broadcast numbers. However, the risk calculus for the executives protecting the four kings remained unchanged. Fighting Pryor meant risking a devastating highlight reel knockout loss against an unpredictable entity. Consequently, the power brokers locked the vault. This permanent blockade, the crushing realization that blood, sweat, and absolute athletic merit could never override corporate politics, was the final invisible blow that shattered Pryor's remaining mental defenses. He required an immediate escape from the crushing reality of his isolation. He found it in the defining narcotic of the 1980s, crack cocaine. This descent into addiction was not merely a tragic personal failing, nor was it solely forced upon him by external pressures. It was the catastrophic collision of unresolved childhood street trauma with a ruthless corporate structure that offered zero psychological support. Crack cocaine provided a massive, instantaneous release of dopamine, temporarily mimicking the visceral chemical rush of a world championship prize fight. More importantly, it acted as a profound dissociative. For a few minutes at a time, Pryor did not have to confront the looming IRS liens, his own internal psychological demons, or the bitter fact that his peers were making 10 times his purse for a fraction of the physical risk. The narcotic offered a synthetic invincibility that the real world aggressively denied him, functioning as a fatal self-medication for a man whose mind was buckling under the weight of an exploitative industry. The physical mechanics of crack cocaine on a high-performance athlete are entirely destructive. The drug violently constricts blood vessels while simultaneously demanding an accelerated heart rate. It destroys cardiovascular endurance. It severely disrupts sleep patterns, preventing the cellular repair necessary after intense physical trauma. It suppresses appetite, stripping away lean muscle mass. Within months, the unstoppable biological engine that had thrown over 100 punches around began to rust and seize, The boxing industry observed this deterioration with calculated indifference. Pryor's training camps became chaotic, paranoid environments. He missed sparring sessions. He disappeared for days into Cincinnati crack houses. His weight fluctuated wildly. The sycophants and handlers on his payroll did not intervene. They functioned as procurement agents, keeping him supplied and pacified. The promoters and network executives received detailed intelligence regarding his addiction. They possessed the leverage to mandate rehabilitation. They held the contracts. They could have suspended his scheduled bouts until he provided clean drug, these aftermath of the Miami spectacle DITS. They did absolutely nothing. Intervention required spending money and halting revenue streams. As long as Pryor could physically walk up the stadium steps and generate ticket sales, his neurological decay was classified as an acceptable operational cost. They watched a prime world champion smoke away his central nervous system and simply adjusted their betting odds. By late 1985, the physical toll became impossible to hide. Pryor was a hollowed-out shell of the hawk. His reflexes were shot. His stamina was non-existent. When it became clear he could no longer survive a championship training camp, the industry efficiently initiated the discard protocol. There were no press conferences expressing concern for his health. There were no severance packages. In December 1985, the International Boxing Federation officially stripped him of his world title for failure to defend it. The paperwork was filed and Pryor was exiled. He vanished from the ring for 29 months. During this period, the machine that had extracted millions from his violence offered zero support. The entourage evaporated the moment the cash flow stopped. Pryor burned through his remaining capital in the narcotics underworld. The IRS seized his remaining assets to cover unpaid taxes from purses that his previous management had failed to account for. The system had successfully drained the asset and left the husk on the street. Total insolvency is a powerful coercive tool. By 1987, Pryor was entirely broke. He needed cash simply to feed his addiction and survive. The promoters recognized the desperation and threw him a financial crumb. They booked him for a fight in Fort Lauderdale against a fringe journeyman named Bobby Joe Young. The purse was a fraction of his championship rate. Pryor was in no condition to fight a professional round, let alone 10. He was a compromised addict going through severe physical withdrawal. The fight on August 8, 1987, was not an athletic contest. It was a public execution of a legacy. Pryor looked emaciated. His legs, once the foundation of his relentless attacks, trembled. He possessed no timing and no power. In the 7th round, Bobby Joe Young, a fighter who would not have survived a single minute with the 1982 version of Aaron Pryor, landed a clean right hand. Pryor collapsed. He was counted out. The system had squeezed one final payday out of him by feeding his ruined body to a B-level opponent. The descent rapidly shifted from the athletic arena to the criminal justice system. The boxing commissions had abandoned him, leaving the police to handle the wreckage. In 1989, law enforcement officers in Cincinnati approached Pryor's vehicle. They found him completely disoriented, in possession of a crack pipe and drug paraphernalia. The man who had defended the undisputed world championship in front of millions was handcuffed, processed through a county lockup, and photographed for a mugshot. The courts did not see a discarded sporting icon. They saw a repeat offender. A judge mandated 2 years of involuntary rehabilitation and probation. Pryor was officially a ward of the state. While the legal system processed his addiction, the medical bill for a lifetime of sanctioned trauma came due. The human eye is not designed to absorb repetitive blunt force impact. Years of absorbing heavy hooks and straight right hands had structurally compromised his ocular anatomy. The retina in his left eye, the thin layer of tissue responsible for processing light and sending visual signals to the brain, began to tear and detach from its underlying support tissue. Simultaneously, severe trauma-induced cataracts clouded his remaining vision. The diagnosis was clinical and final. Pryor was declared legally blind in his left eye. His visual acuity plummeted to 20/400. He could not see punches coming. He could barely navigate a room. It was at this exact moment, with Pryor completely broke, chemically dependent, and legally blind, that the state athletic commissions suddenly discovered their regulatory authority. The same organizations that had willfully ignored crushed pills in water bottles. The same commissions that had sanctioned fights when he was visibly deteriorating from crack cocaine, suddenly cited medical and safety concerns. They permanently revoked his boxing license. They did not strip his license to protect him. They stripped it because he was broken beyond repair and carried zero commercial value. A blind, addicted former champion is a legal liability, not a pay-per-view draw. The bureaucracy effectively shut the door, locked it, and walked away. Aaron Pryor was exiled to the very streets he had fought his entire life to escape, left to navigate the darkness entirely alone. The concrete of Cincinnati in the early 1990s was the final repository for the boxing industry's exhausted collateral. Aaron Pryor, the former undisputed 140-pound champion of the world, was no longer a pay-per-view asset. He was a legally blind, chemically dependent ghost haunting the same impoverished neighborhoods he had fought his entire life to escape. The millions of dollars generated by his fists had been systematically siphoned off by promoters, managers, and the IRS. The establishment had successfully executed its business model: extract the prime athletic years, monetize the violence, and shift the long-term medical and psychological liabilities entirely onto the fighter. Professional boxing is the only major American enterprise that operates with zero post-employment infrastructure. There is no pension plan. There is no corporate health care package for traumatic brain injury. There is no severance pay when the body finally breaks. When Pryor was stripped of his license, he was not placed on medical leave. He was economically terminated with extreme prejudice. He spent the early years of the decade cycling through the criminal justice system and local crack houses. He was a visible walking indictment of a brutal economic machine, but the machine had already moved on to fresh, undamaged inventory. The television networks were busy marketing the next generation of prospects, willfully ignoring the wreckage left in their wake. Survival, for a man in Pryor's condition, is not a Hollywood redemption arc. It is a statistical anomaly. The physiological grip of crack cocaine on a brain already heavily traumatized by years of blunt force impact is nearly impossible to break. The drug had rewired his dopamine receptors, demanding constant chemical stimulation to stave off agonizing physical withdrawal and psychological collapse. Yet, in 1993, Pryor forced a hard reset. He did not achieve sobriety through expensive corporate-sponsored rehabilitation facilities. He did it through a sheer primitive refusal to die in the gutter. He went entirely cold turkey. The process is a biological hell. The nervous system misfires, the body shakes uncontrollably, and the mind turns intensely paranoid. He locked himself away and endured the physical agonizing consequences of the poison the industry had allowed him to consume. By December 1993, Pryor was clean, but sobriety did not restore what the system had stolen. His left eye remained permanently destroyed, a milky white monument to the sanctioning bodies that allowed him to take ungodly amounts of punishment. His finances were permanently crippled. He possessed no marketable corporate skills, but he retained a visceral understanding of the trap. He recognized that the same systemic forces that had weaponized his childhood trauma and monetized his addiction were still operating on the streets of his city, consuming a new generation. Pryor weaponized his own ruin. He became an ordained deacon at the New Friendship Baptist Church in Cincinnati. He did not stand at the pulpit to deliver sanitized, uplifting sermons about the glory of sports. He used his pulpit as a warning siren. He traveled to local prisons, juvenile detention centers, and community halls. He presented himself as Exhibit A. He pointed to his blinded eye, his scarred face, and his empty bank accounts. He stripped away the glamorous mythology of the boxing champion and delivered the cold forensic truth to young men who viewed violence as a way out. He told them exactly how the syndicates operate. He explained how the men in suits will praise your aggression when you are winning, ignore your bleeding when you are hurting, and step right over your body when you are no longer profitable. He did not ask for pity. He demanded awareness. While Pryor spent his final decades attempting to pull kids out of the meat grinder, the architects of his exploitation faced absolutely zero consequences. The regulatory commissioners who lost the urine sample in Miami retired with full state pensions. The network executives who broadcast his chemically altered desperate assaults received industry awards for television production. The promoters who structured the predatory option clauses and locked him out of generational wealth continued to build monopolistic empires, ultimately selling their companies for hundreds of millions of dollars. The 1980s boxing syndicate operated with the impunity of an offshore cartel. They operated in a legal gray zone where federal labor laws did not apply to independent contractors wearing gloves. They engineered an environment where a fighter's death or permanent disability was classified as an occupational hazard, completely insulating the corporate entity from liability. The final toll was collected on October 9, 2016. Aaron Pryor died at the age of 60. The official cause of death was heart disease. It was the clinical conclusion to a life spent operating a biological engine well past its red line. The cardiovascular system that had allowed him to throw 100 punches around. The heart that had been artificially accelerated by Panama Lewis's black bottle, and the arteries that had been constricted by years of crack cocaine abuse finally failed. He did not die in the ring, but the industry was undeniably the primary contributing factor to his early demise. The immediate aftermath of his death followed the standard corporate protocol. The boxing establishment, the same entities that had locked him out, ignored his addiction and discarded him when he went blind, suddenly issued polished press releases. They called him a warrior and a legend, They posted archival footage of his knockouts to drive engagement on their social media platforms. They monetized his corpse just as efficiently as they had monetized his prime. Aaron Pryor's legacy is not a championship belt gathering dust in a display case. It is a cold, hard criminal file on the business of professional combat. He was the ultimate stress test for the morality of the American sports machine, and the machine failed completely. His life proves that the industry does not exist to discover greatness. It exists to manufacture disposable human assets, extract every profitable ounce of their physical and mental well-being, and abandon the empty shells to the streets. The tragedy of Aaron Pryor is not that he fell. The tragedy is that the system functioned exactly as it was designed to.